Okay, so here's something kind of strange. Paul has promised he's going to make it all the way to Rome. Clear destination. Right? But well, it doesn't happen the way you'd expect. Instead, his journey turns into this series of unexpected stops, delays, even setbacks. And here's the weird part, those detours aren't accidents. They actually seem intentional, almost like they're the real story. And honestly, if you think about it, that sounds a lot like how life works for us too, doesn't it? Alright, so let's rewind for a second and set the scene, because this part really matters if you want to understand everything that's about to unfold. Paul is in Jerusalem, and things have gone, well, pretty badly for him, not because he did something wrong, but actually because of what he was saying. See, Paul is going around preaching what he calls the good news. This message that salvation on being made right with God doesn't come from following rules perfectly. It doesn't come from checking every box in the law. Instead, he's saying it comes through faith in Jesus Christ. And that right there is what sets everything off. Because for a lot of the religious leaders at that time, the law was everything. I mean, their entire identity was built around it. The commandments, the traditions, the rituals, this was how they believed you got right with God. You obey, you follow, you stay disciplined, and that's how you earn your standing. And then Paul shows up and basically says, yeah, that's not how it works. You can imagine how that lands, right? It's not just a disagreement. It feels like an attack, like he's undermining the very foundation they've built their lives on. So to them, Paul isn't just mistaken, he's dangerous. He's a threat. But here's the thing, and this is really the core of Paul's message. He's not dismissing the law entirely. He's actually explaining what the law was always meant to do. Because the law never saved anyone, not once. That might sound surprising at first, but think about it. The law was never designed to make people righteous. It was designed to show us that we're not. It's like a mirror, right? A mirror can show you that something's wrong. It can show you the dirt on your face, but it can't clean you. It just reveals the problem, and that's what the law does. It reveals the justice of God. And when you really understand that, when you really see it clearly, it leads to a pretty uncomfortable conclusion. Because if God is just truly just, then everyone gets what they deserve. And that's not exactly good news, because if we're honest, and Paul is very honest about this, we all fall short. No one perfectly keeps the law. No one meets that standard. So if it's all about justice, then what we deserve is punishment, separation from God. That's the reality the law exposes. And this is where Paul introduces something that completely changes the conversation. Grace. Because while the law reveals God's justice, Jesus reveals God's grace. And Paul is going around saying that Jesus stepped in and took the punishment that justice required. That on the cross, all that weight, the consequence, the judgment, it was placed on him instead. So now, instead of earning righteousness through perfect obedience, which no one can actually achieve, people are offered righteousness as a gift through faith, through trusting in what Jesus has already done. And when you put it that way, it becomes a choice. And Paul makes it really clear. You can have justice, or you can have Jesus. And that's a pretty intense choice, right? Because justice means getting exactly what you deserve. No shortcuts. No mercy. Just a straight accounting. But Jesus means mercy. Forgiveness. A second chance that you didn't earn. And Paul's like, yeah, I'll take Jesus every time. But for the people who are deeply invested in the law, who have built their identity on being the ones who follow it, who know it, who teach it, that message feels almost offensive. Because if salvation comes through grace, then it levels the playing field. It means the person who has followed the rules their whole life and the person who hasn't both need the same thing. Both need grace. And that challenges pride. It challenges control. It challenges the idea that you can earn your way to God. So when Paul starts preaching this in Jerusalem, it doesn't just stir up debate. It sparks anger. Real anger. The kind that builds fast. And eventually, it turns into a mob. People aren't just arguing with him anymore. They're trying to kill him. Like, it escalates that quickly. And here's the wild part. Paul isn't even hiding. He's not being secretive about this message. He's openly sharing it, right there in the temple area, right in the center of everything. So when the crowd turns on him, it's chaotic, it's loud, it's violent, and honestly, if nothing else had happened, that probably would have been the end of the story right there. But this is where something unexpected steps in, because Jerusalem at that time is under Roman control. So there's a Roman garrison stationed there, basically soldiers who are keeping an eye on things, making sure things don't get out of hand. And when the Roman commander sees this crowd losing control, this mob attacking a single man, he steps in. Not because he agrees with Paul, not because he understands what Paul is saying, but because from his perspective, this is a public disturbance. So he sends in soldiers and they arrest Paul. Now, that might sound like bad news, and I mean, yeah, it is, but in that moment, it actually saves Paul's life. Because if those soldiers hadn't intervened, the crowd would have finished what they started. So Paul gets taken into custody, he's put into prison. And at this point, the Roman commander is probably just trying to figure out what's going on. Like, who is this guy, and why does everyone want him dead? Because from the outside, it probably looks confusing. There's no obvious crime, no clear charge, just a whole lot of outrage. But underneath all of that, the real issue is the message. It's the idea that salvation isn't earned, that it's given, that it comes through faith in Jesus, not through strict obedience to the law. And that idea, it cuts deep, and because it forces people to confront something they might not want to face, that no matter how good they think they are, it's not enough. And instead of accepting that, some people reject it. And in Paul's case, they don't just reject the message, they try to eliminate the messenger. So that's where we find him. In prison, in Jerusalem. Not because he broke the law, no, but because he challenged the way people thought about it. And what's interesting is, from the outside, it might look like everything has gone wrong, like the mission has stalled, like the story just stops here. But well, that's not actually what's happening at all. So now picture this. Paul is sitting in a prison cell in Jerusalem. Everything we just talked about has already happened. The chaos, the arrest, the confusion, and now it's quiet, or at least quieter. And if you're Paul, you've got to be wondering, okay, what now? Because from a human perspective, this looks like a dead end. You came to Jerusalem to preach, things went sideways, and now you're locked up. Mission over, right? But then, something unexpected happens. That night, Jesus appears to him. And I don't know how you picture that moment, but just pause there for a second. Paul is in prison, probably exhausted, probably replaying everything that just happened, and then the Lord stands by him, and he says, "Be of good cheer." Which is kind of amazing, right? Because that's not exactly what you'd expect to hear in that situation. Like, cheer up, really. But then he explains why. He says, "As you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." And that right there changes everything. Because suddenly, Paul knows, and this isn't the end. There's still somewhere he's going. Rome. And not just going there casually, he's going there with a purpose. To testify. To speak. To keep doing what he's been doing. So now, even though he's still in prison, there's this promise sitting in the middle of it, you're getting to Rome. And if you really think about it, that means something else too. It means he's getting out of this prison, because you can't stay locked up in Jerusalem and also go testify in Rome. One of those things has to change. So in a way, it's like Jesus is saying, this situation you're in right now, it's not permanent. And that's huge. But here's where it gets interesting. Jesus tells him the destination, but he doesn't tell him the journey. He gives him the promise, but not the details in between. And honestly, that's where the tension really starts to build. Because if you were Paul, you might be thinking, okay, great, I'm going to Rome. So, what? Do I get released tomorrow? Do I just head out? How does this work? But that's not how it unfolds. Not even close. Instead, what happens next is, well, kind of a long series of delays. Detours, unexpected turns. Because Paul doesn't go straight from Jerusalem to Rome. There's no clean, direct path. First, he gets transferred. He's moved from prison in Jerusalem to prison in Caesarea, and you might think, okay, maybe that's progress, but then he stays there for over 2 years. 2 years just sitting in prison, waiting. And during that time, he's not just forgotten or ignored, he's actually put on trial again and again. He has to defend himself against accusations that aren't even true. So imagine holding on to this promise. You're going to Rome while your current reality is just more waiting, more confinement, more uncertainty. That's not easy. And eventually, after dealing with all of that, Paul reaches a point where he basically says, all right, enough of this. And he uses his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar, which in that world is like taking your case to the highest court possible. And that decision, that's what finally sets things in motion toward Rome. But even then, it's still not smooth, because now he has to actually travel there. And the journey itself becomes another whole story. There's a storm at sea, not just a rough day on the water, like a full-on, life-threatening storm, at the kind where people start to lose hope that they're even going to survive. And then, the ship gets wrecked, literally destroyed. So now Paul, who's already been imprisoned for years, is clinging to debris in the ocean, just trying to stay alive. Eventually, he makes it to land this island called Malta. You'd think, okay, finally, a break. But no, because while he's there, he gets bitten by a poisonous snake. And at this point, it's almost like really another thing, and yet he survives that too. And then finally, after all of that, he makes it to Rome. But here's what really stands out. From the moment Jesus made that promise in that prison cell, to the moment Paul actually arrives in Rome, it's been about 3 years. 3 years. Between the promise and the fulfillment. And none of those details were mentioned when Jesus first spoke to him. He didn't say, hey, Paul, you're going to Rome. But first, you'll spend a couple of years in prison, go through multiple trials, survive a shipwreck, and get bitten by a snake. He didn't say any of that. And honestly, aren't you kind of glad? Because think about it, if you knew everything ahead of time, every difficulty, every delay, every moment of uncertainty, would you even want to start? Sometimes we wouldn't, and that's kind of the point. God often gives us the promise without giving us the full map. He tells us where we're going, but not exactly how we're going to get there. And that's not because he's hiding something to be difficult. It's because he knows us. He knows that if we saw everything at once, it might overwhelm us. It might discourage us before we even begin. So instead, he gives us just enough. Enough to move forward, enough to trust, and then, step by step, we walk it out. And along the way, there are going to be moments that feel like setbacks, like delays, like things aren't going according to plan. But what if those aren't interruptions? What if they're actually part of the plan? Because from Paul's perspective, every one of those moments could have felt like, this isn't what was supposed to happen. But in reality, they were all leading him exactly where he was meant to go. Just not in the way he expected. And maybe that's something we can relate to a little more than we'd like to admit. Because we all have those moments where we feel like we're stuck, or delayed, or off track. And we start to wonder if the promise still holds. But if there's anything this part of Paul's story shows, it's that the promise can still be true even when the path looks completely different than what you imagined. You're still going somewhere. It just might not be a straight line. So now Paul is in Caesarea, nice, and this is where things start to look like one long pause. Because remember, he already has that promise he's going to Rome. That part is settled. But instead of moving forward, he's just sitting in prison, day after day. And at first glance, it kind of feels like nothing is happening. Like the story has stalled. But this is where that idea of divine detours really starts to come into focus, because what looks like a delay is actually something else entirely. See? While Paul is in Caesarea, he's not just waiting around doing nothing. God is quietly arranging moments, specific moments where Paul gets to speak to people he would have never crossed paths with otherwise. And not just anyone. We're talking about powerful, influential people. The first one is Governor Felix, and now Felix is basically the Roman authority over that region. Like, he's the one in charge. And at some point during Paul's imprisonment, Felix brings him in to hear him out, which, again, is kind of interesting, because Felix doesn't have to do that. He could have just ignored him completely. But instead, he calls for Paul, and he listens. And not just once. Paul ends up having multiple conversations with Felix. And in those conversations, Paul does what he always does. He talks about his faith in Christ. But it's not just casual conversation. He's getting into real topics. Righteousness, self-control, judgment to come. I mean, those are not exactly light, comfortable subjects, and you can imagine how that lands, because at one point, it actually says that Felix becomes afraid. Afraid, which is kind of telling, right? Something about what Paul is saying. It's getting through, it's hitting a nerve. But instead of leaning into that moment, instead of actually responding, Felix does something very human. He pushes it off. He basically says, okay, go away for now. I'll call for you again when it's more convenient. And you hear that and you think, man, that sounds familiar. Because how often do people do that? They feel something. They sense that something is true, or at least important. But instead of dealing with it, they delay it. I'll think about it later, maybe another time, and that's exactly what Felix does. But there's another layer to it too. Because while he's having these conversations with Paul, he's also hoping for something else. Money. He's hoping Paul will offer him a bribe. Like, hey, maybe if I keep bringing this guy in, he'll slip me something, and I can let him go. So on one hand, you've got this guy who's clearly being impacted by what he's hearing. But on the other hand, he's still operating out of greed, still looking for personal gain, and that tension just kind of sits there. So Felix keeps calling for Paul. They keep talking. These moments keep happening, but nothing really changes. And eventually, time just passes. A lot of time. 2 years. 2 years of Paul being held there. And at the end of it, Felix is replaced. There's a new governor, Festus. And here's the part that feels a little frustrating, because Felix, knowing he's on his way out, decides to leave Paul in prison just to keep the Jewish leaders happy. So after all those conversations, all those moments where he had the chance to do the right thing, he doesn't. He just leaves Paul there. And you kind of sit with that and think, wow, what a missed opportunity. But again, from God's perspective, the story isn't over, because now Festus steps in. And Festus seems a little different, more reasonable, at least. When he starts looking into Paul's case, he realizes pretty quickly that something doesn't add up. The accusations don't really stick. There's no clear crime. It's more like a dispute about religious beliefs. And from a Roman legal standpoint, that's not exactly something you put a man to death for. So Festus is trying to figure out what to do. But he's also in a tough position, because he's new. He wants to maintain good relationships with the Jewish leaders. He doesn't want to cause unnecessary tension. So instead of just releasing Paul, which he probably could have justified, he starts looking for a way to manage the situation politically. At one point, he even suggests moving the case back to Jerusalem, which on the surface might sound reasonable, but it's actually dangerous, because Paul knows that if he goes back there are people who still want him dead. So now Paul is stuck in this situation where, again, it feels like things aren't moving forward. New governor, same uncertainty, different person in charge, but still no resolution. And yet, all of this is still part of those divine detours, because even though it looks like delay, even though it feels like being stuck, Paul is being placed in front of people he would never normally reach. A governor, another governor, people in positions of authority, and each time he gets the same opportunity to speak, to share, to point them toward Jesus. And here's what's really interesting. None of this was part of Paul's original plan. He didn't set out thinking, you know what, I'm going to spend a couple of years in prison so I can talk to government officials. That wasn't the strategy, but it became the opportunity. And that's kind of how these divine detours work. They don't look important in the moment. They often look like interruptions, like delays, like things going wrong. But behind the scenes, something else is happening. Doors are opening, conversations are being set up, moments are being arranged. And the question is, will you recognize them when they come? Because Paul does. Even in prison, he keeps speaking, he keeps sharing. He doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. He uses the ones he's given. And that's what turns this whole season from the outside. It looks like wasted time into something meaningful, because every delay becomes an opportunity. Every detour becomes intentional, even when it doesn't feel like it at the time. So just when you think, okay, maybe things are finally about to move forward for Paul, maybe this situation is wrapping up, there's another twist, another unexpected stop, another one of those divine detours. Because now new people enter the story. And not just ordinary people, these are high-level, powerful figures. King Agrippa and Bernice. And at first, when you hear those names, it kind of sounds official, maybe even respectable. Like, okay, a king and what his wife, his queen. But it's not that simple, not even close. So let's slow down and unpack who these people actually are. King Agrippa. This is Agrippa. The second is part of a long line of rulers known as the Herods. And if that name sounds familiar, it should, because this family shows up all over the Bible, and not usually in a good way. This is the same family line where one of their ancestors, Herod the Great, ordered the killing of baby boys around the time Jesus was born. That's the kind of legacy we're talking about. And it doesn't really improve from there. Agrippa's own father, also named Agrippa, was the one who had James executed. And then, not long after that, he basically accepted worship from people like he was a god. And according to the account, he was struck down and died in a pretty intense way. So this family history, it's heavy, powerful, yes, but also deeply flawed. And now you've got Agrippa II stepping into that line. He's not exactly a king in the full sense. He's more like a regional ruler under the authority of Rome. Kind of a middleman. Rome is still in charge. But Agrippa acts as a go-between, especially when it comes to Jewish customs and issues. Because here's the interesting part, his family, the Herods, weren't originally Jewish by blood. They were from a different background. But over time, they adopted Jewish customs and practices, so they had just enough understanding of Jewish law and tradition to navigate that world, but they were still closely tied to Rome, which made them useful. They could relate to the Jewish people, but they were loyal to the empire. So Agrippa ends up in this unique position. He understands the religious context better than most Roman officials, but he's still part of the political machine. And then there's Bernice, and this is where things get complicated, because Bernice is not his wife, she's his sister. Yeah, and history tells us that their relationship was, well, not appropriate. There were strong rumors and even records that they were involved in an incestuous relationship. So when they show up together, presenting themselves with all this royal appearance and authority, underneath it, there's a whole lot of brokenness, a whole lot of moral compromise. And honestly, when you step back and look at all of them together, the people Paul has now been brought before, it's kind of a pattern. You've got Felix, who was corrupt and looking for bribes. You've got Festus, who's trying to play politics. And now you've got Agrippa and Bernice, wrapped up in power, history, and some very questionable personal choices. It's like every person Paul stands in front of, there's something off, something messy, something broken. And yet this is the audience God is arranging, which is kind of the point. Because if you're being honest, you might look at people like this and think, yeah, they're probably not interested in hearing about God. Or even, do they really deserve to hear it? I mean, look at their lives, look at their choices, look at the power they've abused, the things they've done. But here's the thing, God doesn't see it that way. He sees people flawed, yes, complicated, absolutely, but still people he loves, people he died for, people he wants to reach. And that's what's happening here. This isn't just a political meeting. It's not just a legal case. This is another divine setup that because Festus, trying to figure out what to do with Paul, explains the situation to Agrippa. He's basically like, I've got this guy, and honestly, I don't really get what the issue is. It's something about their religion, something about this man named Jesus who was dead, but Paul says is alive. And Agrippa hears that, and something sparks his interest. He says, I'd like to hear him myself. And you might think that's just curiosity. But from another perspective, that's opportunity. Because now, once again, Paul is being placed in front of someone who probably never would have listened to him otherwise. A king, a ruler, someone with influence. And standing right next to him, Bernice. And all of their history, all of their choices, all of their baggage. And God is like, yes, them too. And I think that's such an important detail to notice. Because sometimes we quietly decide in our own minds who is and isn't likely to respond, who seems too far gone, too uninterested, too complicated. But this moment challenges that. Because if God is willing to orchestrate all of this to keep Paul in prison, to move him through governors, to set up this exact meeting just so these two can hear the message, then maybe no one is off the table. Not the powerful, not the broken, not even the ones whose lives seem completely out of line. And here's the wild part. They don't even realize what's about to happen. To them, this is just another event, another appearance, another day of listening to a case. But in reality, they're about to hear something that could change everything. And it's not coming from someone powerful. It's coming from a prisoner. Coming from a witch. Honestly, just adds another layer to the whole thing. Because God doesn't always use the people you'd expect to reach the people you'd think are unreachable. Sometimes he uses someone in chains to speak to someone on a throne. And that's exactly where this story is about to go. So now the moment finally arrives. And it's not quiet. It's not subtle. It's actually kind of a spectacle. Because when Agrippa and Bernice come in, they don't just walk into the room casually. No, this is full-on ceremony. There's pomp, there's display, there's presence. You can almost hear it, the movement, the attention, the weight of importance in the room. They enter this large auditorium, this theater in Caesarea, surrounded by high-ranking officials, military commanders, prominent people from the city. It's a gathering of influence, power, status. Everyone who matters is there. And then Paul is brought in, and just pause there for a second because the contrast is kind of striking. On one side, you've got royalty, dressed in impressive clothing, walking in with confidence, with authority, with everything that signals power. And on the other side, you've got a prisoner, no status, no outward authority, probably still in chains. And yet he's the one who's about to speak, and not just speak, but actually hold the attention of the entire room. So Agrippa gives him permission. He basically says, all right, you can speak for yourself. And Paul steps forward. And what's interesting is how he starts. He doesn't come in defensive. He's not panicked. He's not angry. He actually says he's happy to be able to speak, which is kind of unexpected, right? But it makes sense when you realize this isn't just a trial to him, this is an opportunity. So he begins, and he acknowledges Agrippa directly. He points out that Agrippa is familiar with Jewish customs and questions, which means essentially you understand the context here, you'll get what I'm saying. And then he starts telling his story, not as a legal defense, but as a testimony. He goes back to the beginning. He talks about his life growing up, how he was known among his people, how he lived according to the strictest form of their religion, a Pharisee. And that word carries weight because Pharisees were serious about the law. Like, they were disciplined, committed, respected for their devotion. And Paul is basically saying, that was me. I wasn't on the outside. I wasn't careless. I was all in. And then he brings up the real reason he's on trial. Like, it's because of hope. The hope that God would fulfill his promises, the hope that what the prophets spoke about would actually come to pass. And then he asks this question almost like he's challenging the room a little. Why should it be considered unbelievable that God raises the dead? And you can almost feel that question hang in the air, because that's really the issue. The resurrection, the idea that Jesus didn't just die, but came back to life. And then Paul gets very personal. He says, look, I didn't always believe this. In fact, he goes the opposite direction. He admits that he used to actively oppose the name of Jesus. He wasn't neutral. He wasn't unsure. He was against it, strongly. He talks about how he imprisoned believers, how he supported their execution, how he went from place to place, trying to force them to deny their faith. He says he was furious with them, like deeply angry, driven, obsessed even. And you can imagine people in that room listening, thinking, wait, this is the same guy because now he's standing there completely changed. So what happened? And that's where he tells them. He describes this moment on the road to Damascus, midday, bright sun already overhead, and then suddenly a light appears. But not just any light, brighter than the sun itself. Surrounding him, overwhelming. And it knocks them all to the ground. And then he hears a voice speaking directly to him. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And there's this line that's almost piercing. It is hard for you to kick against the goads, which basically means you're resisting something, but it's only hurting you. You're fighting against what you know deep down is true. And Paul responds, who are you, Lord? And the answer changes everything. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And just like that, everything flips, because the very one he thought he was opposing is now standing before him, alive. And then Jesus gives him direction, a purpose. He tells him to stand up because he's being appointed as a witness. Not just to what he's seen, but to what he will see. And he gives him a mission to go to people, both Jews and Gentiles, and open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, to help them receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance through faith. And when Paul says all of this, he's not just recounting an experience. He's explaining his transformation, why he changed, why he's standing there now, saying what he's saying. And then he brings it back to the present. He says, I didn't ignore that vision. He obeyed it. He started preaching, first in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, then throughout the region, and eventually to the Gentiles. And what was his message? That people should repent, turn to God, and live in a way that reflects that change. And he connects it back to the bigger story, the prophets, Moses, all pointing to the same thing, that the Messiah would suffer, that he would rise from the dead, and that he would bring light to everyone, not just one group, everyone. And right as Paul is building this case, laying it all out, clearly, confidently, something interrupts him. Festus. And not quietly either. He basically blurts out, Paul, you're out of your mind. Like, this is too much. All this learning, it's made you crazy. And you can kind of picture the moment, the tension. Some people probably thinking the same thing, just not saying it out loud. But Paul doesn't get defensive. He stays calm. He says, I'm not crazy. What I'm saying is true. It's reasonable. And then he turns back to Agrippa, because now it's personal again. He says, the king knows about these things. This wasn't done in secret. And then he asks him directly, do you believe the prophets? And then he adds, I know that you do. And that question, it puts Agrippa on the spot, because now it's not just about Paul's story. It's about what Agrippa believes and how he's going to respond. And Agrippa answers, but it's not a full yes. It's not a clear no either. He says, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." Almost. And that word just kind of hangs there because it's so close. So close to a decision, but not quite there. And Paul responds in a way that's honestly pretty powerful, say? He says, "I wish not just you, but everyone here today would become like me." And then he pauses, except for these chains, and you can almost feel the weight of that moment, because here's a man in chains, standing in front of people with power, and he's saying, "What I have, I want you to have it too. Not the circumstances, but the faith, the transformation, the hope." And after all of that, the scene starts to close. The king stands up, the governor, Bernice, everyone begins to leave. And as they talk among themselves, there's this quiet conclusion that starts to form. This man has done nothing deserving of death or even imprisonment. And Agrippa even says to Festus, he could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, which is kind of ironic, because from their perspective, it looks like Paul complicated his own situation, but in reality, he's exactly where he needs to be. So when you step back from all of that, the trials, the speeches, the reactions, there's this question that kind of lingers. What does all of this actually mean for us? Because it's one thing to watch Paul go through all of this. It's another thing to see how it connects to our own lives. And I think the first thing that stands out like really clearly is this idea of success. Because if you're just looking at the results, Paul doesn't exactly come out on top here. Think about it. He speaks to Felix, but nothing really changes. He speaks to Festus, gets called crazy. He speaks to Agrippa, and Agrippa says, almost, which is honestly one of the most frustrating responses you can hear. So if you measure success by outcomes, by how many people respond, how many people change, how many people believe, then it kind of looks like Paul failed. But that's not how God measures it, and not even close. And because from God's perspective, success isn't about the results. It's about obedience. Did you say what I asked you to say? Did you go where I asked you to go? Did you speak when I gave you the opportunity? That's it. And Paul does all of that. Every single time he's given a moment, he steps into it. He doesn't control the response. He doesn't try to force an outcome. He just stays faithful. And that's actually a huge shift in how we think. Because a lot of times we hesitate to speak up because we're already thinking about the result. What if they don't believe me? What if it's awkward? What if nothing happens and we let that stop us before we even start? But the truth is, the outcome was never our responsibility to begin with. We don't change hearts. We don't save people. That's not our role. Our role is to be obedient in the moment we're given, to show up, to speak, to share, and then let God handle the rest. Because sometimes what we think is a small moment is actually part of something bigger we can't see. Maybe we're just planting a seed. Maybe someone else already planted and we're just watering it, and somewhere down the line, God brings it to life. But we don't always get to see that part, and that's okay. Because success was never about seeing the full result. It was about being faithful in the part we were given. And that leads right into the second thing. Because if God is the one creating these moments, these divine detours, these unexpected conversations, then there's a reason for them. And that reason is simple, like God opens doors, so we open our mouths, and I know that sounds obvious, but it's actually something we tend to avoid because it's easier to stay quiet. It's easier to keep things private, to just live your life and hope people figure it out on their own. And yeah, there's value in how we live. Absolutely. Our actions matter. The way we treat people, the way we carry ourselves, that all speaks. But at some point, words matter too. Because people can't fully understand what they've never actually heard. And Paul never relies on just being a good example. Every time he's given the chance, he speaks, he explains, he tells people about Jesus. And that's not always comfortable. Sometimes it's awkward. Sometimes it feels risky. Sometimes you're not even sure how it's going to land. But if God is the one opening the door, bringing someone into your life, creating that moment, then there's a purpose behind it. And the question becomes, will we step into it or will we hold back? Because those moments don't always look dramatic. They're not always big, obvious opportunities. Sometimes it's just a conversation with a coworker, a moment with a neighbor, a question someone asks when you weren't expecting it. And it's easy to brush those off. to think, maybe another time, but what if that was the moment? What if that was the door? And that brings us to the last thing. And this one's really important because a lot of people get stuck right here. They think, okay, I get it, but I don't really have a story. Like, I don't have anything dramatic to share. Maybe you didn't have this big life-altering moment. Maybe your story is quieter, more gradual. And because of that, it can feel like it doesn't really matter as much. Like it's not as powerful, but that's just not true. Every Christian has a testimony worth sharing. Every single one. Because your story, however it looks, is still a story of God's grace. And grace is powerful. Whether it shows up in a dramatic turnaround or in a steady, consistent life, it's still grace, and it still matters. Think about it this way. A dramatic story might connect with one kind of person, but a quiet, steady story might connect with someone else. And you never really know who needs to hear your version of it, your experience, your perspective, the way God worked in your life. Because that's the part that's real. That's the part people can relate to. And honestly, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just you being honest about what God has done and letting that be enough. Because it is enough. And when you put all of that together, it really comes down to this. You don't have to have perfect results. You don't have to say everything flawlessly. You don't need a dramatic story. You just need to be willing. Willing to step into the moments God gives you. Willing to speak when the door opens. Willing to trust that He can use even the simplest story for something bigger than you can see. And if you do that, if you stay faithful in those small and everyday opportunities, you might never fully see the impact, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. So maybe those unexpected moments in your life, they're not random after all. Maybe they're those same kinds of divine detours, little openings where you get to share something real. And yeah, it might feel small or even awkward, but it matters more than you think. So stay aware. Stay willing, and hey, if this gave you something to think about, feel free to stick around, maybe hit like or subscribe, only if you want to see more like this.